So, in my little journey in finding symbolic references across characters, I've been analysing a lot of past characters while I prepare for the release of Juno and Augusta. Similar to my previous Carnival video, I found a bit of an unlikely candidate for investigation in Brant, especially because when I first played through Brant's story, I, to be honest, was nearly going fully through it with the intention of just getting the 100 asteroids at the end and just fucking off. And I think that's a little bit reflected in a lot of the discussion around the story, where people say that Brant's story is good, but it's not really complex in the same way that, for example, Carnivale's story is. So when I actually started thinking about and investigating both Brant's story and his character, I found that, similar to a lot of post-Renascita characters, there's actually a lot of legwork done by Kuro in terms of symbolism and references, and some of them actually really surprised me. For instance, I actually realized halfway through that basically the majority of Brant's story and character is inspired by Bakhtin's concept of the Carnivalesque, which is honestly, even for me, pretty far off the deep end when it comes to literature study, for instance. For me, personally, I hadn't even visited the concept of Bakhtin's work in years. The last time I was even reading that stuff when I was reading Dostoevsky, and because of that I had to learn a lot of that stuff just for the video. So definitely, when it comes to Brant's character, it's actually inspired by a lot of rich symbolism and references that I myself just wasn't expecting. It's a light-hearted story, for sure, but there's a lot dwelling underneath the surface that I think makes its storytelling really underrated. So hopefully, as always, you learn something new and perhaps appreciate the story a little bit more. I'll post a small glossary, and I hope you enjoy the video. Spoilers ahead. I think that in order to understand a lot of the symbolism of Brant, we need to understand a little bit of the story of the Pilgrim's Sale. If you weren't listening in Act 3 of Renascita, or just skipping parts, which I understand, the Pilgrim's Sale is essentially a form of punishment that the Order of the Deep, in Ragunna, uses to send non-believers and non-conformers on essentially a ship voyage to repent for their sins. The ship is of course understocked and in crappy condition, so it's basically a voyage doomed to fail that happens to be framed as a religious pilgrimage. A lot of characters in the story, like Chacona, Gracia, and Brant, all have their stories tied to this punishment, with Brant having been sent to Pilgrim's Sale as a child for making fun of the Sentinel statue. The destination of these ships is actually a visitable location in-game called Penitent's End, whose name in itself connotes the final destination of someone seeking salvation from God. Within this dead wasteland, countless TDs stand to tear apart any people who survive the voyage, with a final boss, being the Dragon of Dirge, present to make sure no one is left alive. Of course, before the Dragon of Dirge was corrupted by the Order to kill any survivors on the Pilgrim's Sale, we now know that it was basically Carnivale's pet dragon. But what's really important here is that the Dragon of Dirge's actual name is Gehinnom. Gehinnom, or Gehenna, for people who are brain-rotten from Blue Archive or something, is a Jewish reference and a real place, actually, outside Jerusalem, that perfectly fits the theme of Penitent's End. Just as how this graveyard of both ships and souls serves as a final destination from those the Order punishes for having no faith, Gehinnom was a place that was a site of child sacrifice in ancient times, and later was also cursed, with some versions of the Bible even translating Gehinnom to mean hell. If you've watched my For the over video, which I recommend you to if you haven't, you may remember that we discussed the Christian concept of purgatory as a place for the purification of the soul. In some sects of Judaism, Gehinnom is kind of similar. For example, in Talmudic Judaism, Gehinnom is presented as a place made of layers, similar to purgatory, with each layer being occupied by a famous sinner from Jewish history. It is a place that doesn't just connote hell and suffering, but also death and divine judgment. It connotes purification, a place of spiritual purification. And all of that matches Penitent's end perfectly. Naturally, the order claims that the people aboard the pilgrim sail are undergoing a pilgrimage to restore their faith, but we know perfectly well it's only a nearly guaranteed death sentence. As their ships are wrecked on Penitent's End, the unfortunate passengers are faced with the reality that their sentence of atonement can only be carried through with their deaths. If they are not ripped apart by the tacit discords that line the wasted shore, then they still have to face the dragon of dirge, Gehinnom himself. As of the connotation of historical child sacrifice in the real Gehinnom, nobody is spared admission from the pilgrim sail. And it is within this tragic background that the story of Brant truly begins.
We shall create wonders!
In my last video, I talked a little bit about Shakespeare's The Tempest, and how Rover, symbolizing the storm that heralds change in the play, is a key reason why one of their voice lines when they alt is, "I am the Tempest." Kuro has paid a bit more homage to the play, however, because once I actually started observing it a little bit, Brant's life and story is basically a one-for-one parallel with the plot of the main character of The Tempest, Prospero. And in my last video, I didn't really explain The Tempest in a lot of detail, so I will go a bit into that here before we continue. Essentially, The Tempest is a story that begins with the Duke of Milan, Prospero, being betrayed, humiliated, and exiled by his brother. Sent out to sea with his infant daughter Miranda, he does not get enough supplies and would have died on the open ocean, if not for a kind servant called Gonzalo, who secretly packs him his supplies and magic books. Prospero washes up on an island, and having learned magic, he takes the entire island and its inhabitants under his wing. Fast forward like about 10 years, and Prospero has basically made the island his home, and one day, the same people who wronged him all those years ago are sailing by the island on a ship. So, he casts a magical thunderstorm, the Tempest, to shipwreck them on the island. And through a series of magical events, he basically controls everything they do and utterly humiliates them, forcing them basically to their knees as he eventually confronts them. However, instead of taking revenge on the people who wronged him, he chooses to forgive them and sails back to Italy, now having cleared his name. So if you know about Brant's story, then you can probably already see the immense parallels between Brant and Prospero. Both of them are sent on damned voyages where they are expected to die. Both of them have some sort of magic power that helps them survive this disaster. Both of them act as basically playmasters in using trickery and magic to achieve their goals and thwart their oppressors, and both of them also seek to redeem their names and expose the ones that have wronged them. And I think what's really important to kind of understand, especially if you haven't read the play of The Tempest itself, is that when you're reading the script, Prospero is a character who, with his magic, is basically always in control. The play almost reads like Prospero is some sort of puppet master, controlling the strings of all the people on the island. And that's something I found very amusing with Brant's character as well, because whenever you see Brant in action, whether it's in the story, or in dialogue and lore, or even in trailers, he always is in control. Not only does he have the responsibility of being a captain and safeguarding his crew from dangers, just like how Prospero takes care of Miranda's safety, in any other situation regardless, he always portrays himself as the flaming immortal, as the master of the show. That is, of course, a parallel with Prospero, because just like how Brant uses his resonance abilities of fire to light the way for both his crew and their performances, Prospero uses magic spectacle to work any situation to his advantage. The other thing you have to consider is the reason why Prospero and Brant do all of this. While Prospero exacts all the actions in the play to recover his lost reputation and position as the Duke of Milan by punishing those who have wronged him, Brant also seeks to get back at the Order who banished him to the Pilgrim's Sale when he was a child, planning to use performance to expose their lies one day, so that he and his crew can walk in Ragusa one day free from persecution. Even the cave where he bases his operations, the Fool's Elysium, is a parallel to the cave that Prospero himself bases in during his stay on the island. However, whether or not Brant will leave all of this behind now that Fenrico has said that he can walk in Ragusa as a free man, however, is still up in the air.
All mortals stumble, but through pilgrimage, they have cleansed their souls and atoned for their transgressions. They have earned their right to return to this divinely blessed land.
You can definitely color me surprised when I found such an interesting framework of symbolism to even exist in Brant's story. So much so that I actually had to refresh myself in order to just prepare to talk about this section. To be honest, Bakhtin's concept of the Carnivalesque, which is something he introduces in both his book, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, and later basically finalizes in Rabelais and His World, is pretty off the deep end, as I've said, even for literature study. I'll try to keep it simple and specific so everyone can understand, because, in my opinion at least, it's actually a very fascinating and incredibly relevant point to Brant's mentality and story. Essentially, the Carnivalesque is a perspective through which you can look at the world and culture. One thing you have to understand before we go through this is that Bakhtin classifies systems of culture as either centripetal or centrifugal. A centripetal system of culture is one which you have to imagine kind of like a vortex. It tries to bring everything to a unified understanding and a truth. In essence, it's a system of culture which sucks everything towards the middle. You can see this with the Order of the Deep in Ragusa. It's a governing body that regulates beliefs and culture to the single monolithic truth of the Sentinel. If you ask Fenrico after Act 3 Renascita quest why, for example, he allows the punishment of the Pilgrim's Sale to continue, he says, "We must create a land that aligns with the Sentinel's vision. We must purge this land of individuals who stray from the righteous path to ensure that our collective will remains unified and pure." As such, it is no exaggeration to say that the Order of the Deep that governs Renascita functions on a centripetal system of expression and culture. It's important to understand as well that a lot of Bakhtin's work on the concept of culture and the Carnivalesque was based on his own experiences living in the Soviet Union, where culture was also heavily regulated into a sort of stagnant, centripetal system of its own. And it's because of all this that Bakhtin envisions the opposite of this in the centrifugal cultural system, which would later evolve into the Carnivalesque. In a centrifugal system, different perspectives, opinions, and even things that would be considered transgressions in the centripetal system are not only allowed but encouraged. It's centrifugal. Essentially, instead of drawing in culture into the unifying center, it pushes it out and encourages difference. When you see, for example, the atmosphere of the Troop of Fools, it is very clearly a centrifugal system. Even though Brant is in the middle, and the crew still exist within the cultural units of the Fool's troop, Brant is on a near equal standing with all the crew members. They chat with him, make fun of him, make bets with him, and Brant himself always echoes their differences and individuality, even if it is something as simple as cocktail preferences. We can see this critical duality of centripetal and centrifugal displayed perfectly with a scene from the 2.0 story, as the centripetal order is perfectly compared to the centrifugal Troop of Fools, as follows.
When freedom is unchecked, the insidious evil of division takes root. People of the center, do not lose yourselves in these fleeting pleasures. Remember what unites us all.
What is that? Friends! Why lead a life of restraints? Why not live like there's no tomorrow? High walls fall fast. All you free spirits, join us to set sail again!
Additionally, at the conclusion of all of Brant's character showcases, we see a mask that combines the designs of his and Fenrico's masks together. In essence, Brant's Troop of Fools and he himself function as a bit of a character foil or an opposite for Fenrico's Order of the Deep. And this finally leads us to the Carnivalesque. As we said before, the Carnivalesque is a sort of perspective you can use to look at culture, and the world even in general. Bakhtin essentially makes a framework of a centrifugal system based on the carnivals of the Renaissance. And you might be saying, oh shit, isn't Rinascita as a map basically just Renaissance Italy? Yeah, it is. Because within these carnivals, you would basically see a dissolution of social class, of hierarchy, of social etiquette, of all the things that keep people apart from one another. It's almost similar to a Roman Saturnalia, if you've heard of that, which was a festival where people basically played opposite day. Masters became slaves, slaves became masters, etc. In these environments, you had people from radically different walks of life and social classes, laughing, talking with each other, even insulting and joking with one another. It was this open, centrifugal environment where anyone and everyone can intersect, talk, argue, and have complete freedom of expression that is at the crux of understanding Bakhtin's perspective of the Carnivalesque. The Carnivalesque, as such, has four main principles. One, that the Carnivalesque has complete freedom of interaction between wildly different people. I think this is shown most evidently when the 2.0 story reaches its climax, with the four main characters taking the stage to applause. If you think about it, in this scene, you have someone which is basically royalty, someone who is basically a god, someone who is basically a wanton criminal, and someone with a suitcase who likes to lick people. It is a completely crazy band of misfits, if you think about it. And that's kind of the point. That's the essence of the carnival, an essence of an event where anybody can participate. So anyway, the second principle of the Carnivalesque is that any behavior, even if it defies social etiquette, is permitted. You can see how Brant weaves subtle disrespect for authority or some other otherwise socially incorrect behavior into basically all of his performances, for example. When you see that the Carnivalesque is oftentimes considered an environment to critique authority and religion, for instance, with these mannerisms, Brant's goal to expose the lies of the order through performance and laughter suddenly makes a lot more sense. The third principle is essentially that of the destruction of boundaries. Anything that separates your worldview into dual two parts is essentially melted away. For instance, there is no conception of smart and dumb. There is no conception of weak and strong. You can see how Brant's troupe of fools, for instance, is comprised of an absurdly diverse cast of characters, where everyone is on an equal playing field. The fourth, and arguably the most important principle for our discussion, is a complete disrespect for authority, especially religious authority. As what is sacred and pious is stripped away, we can see how Brant's troupe of fools, being made up of the former survivors of the Pilgrim's Sail, naturally have a complete aversion and disrespect for the Order on the Deep. So, when we compare the Carnivalesque with the literal Carnival of Ragusa, we can see that it is not actually only just a literal celebration and performance, but also a display of the dichotomy of the Order compared with the Fool's troupe, or the values of the Carnivalesque in full display. As you can see from Brant's first cherished item that echoes the need to find the truth, we see how Brant seeks to use comedy and performance in order to one day expose the Order's lies. Like Prospero, he does not choose the path of violence, instead attaining victory by winning hearts and minds, by turning the howls of oppressors into the people's laughter.
Mounds of vanity built on tainted riches. My blade shall cleanse their corruption. The bells of evening prayers have lost their true tone. Let my words compose a new chorale. The immortal returned, lives in the hearts of the worthy. For all eternity!
While we're off talking about the Carnivalesque, it is a good opportunity to also talk about the Fool and Commedia dell'arte. The Fool, which appears across stories of history, as well as plays like Shakespeare's King Lear and Twelfth Night, has always been romanticized as a character that can exist outside of social hierarchies, even being able to insult and joke kings and royalty. When we consider the Carnivalesque that we talked about previously, the role of the Fool is both an insult as well as a liberating role. While the Order calls the faithless criminals fools, Brant and his fool's troupe consider the term to be liberating and empowering. In yearning for freedom and having, in their words, a spirit strong enough to break the cages of the Order's strict hierarchy, the fools continue to yearn for the liberation of the human spirit, while their counterpart, the Order of the Deep, seek to suppress it under the authority of the Sentinel. In order to do this, Kuro pushes the design and performance of the troupe of fools as very heavily inspired by the style of the Italian Renaissance Commedia dell'arte. Like, with so many Italian references with Brant and other characters like Frolova and Rinascita, are we even surprised at this point? Anyway, Commedia dell'arte is actually a pretty common point of symbolism in a lot of different texts and games. For instance, something that I guess a lot of you would know is that if you've played or even know about Genshin Impact, all the knaves or the villains are based on characters of the stock Commedia dell'arte. While Kuro hasn't taken the same approach with that, the aesthetics of Brant's Fool's troupe is very clearly inspired by the ridiculous costumes and the use of masks which are mandatory for many of these performances. However, it's not just the style but also the actual character of Brant and the troupe that reflects Commedia dell'arte. For instance, one important component of it is a unique place of character and roles. If you didn't know, Commedia dell'arte is a bit of a special drama genre, because unlike other dramas, Commedia dell'arte always has a recurring set of 4 character types and about 14 or so main characters, which at this point many people already know the names of just because of stuff like Arlecchino and Scaramouche in Genshin. What this essentially means is that the Commedia dell'arte is a genre that heavily focuses on character roles, and this is something that Brant himself echoes. In his cherished item, All the World's a Stage, and a story, Reflections by the Campfire, you can see that despite despising some of the roles he has to play, Brant performs many of them. From the unstoppable heroes, the comical clown, the extravagant nobleman, the scheming courtier, and even the devout acolyte, Brant flawlessly plays any role that is required. In his words, he respected the stage and every role he played because he knew the stage was his ocean. In addition to this, another parallel between Commedia dell'arte and Brant is the aspect of improvisation. Commedia dell'arte is in itself a form of improvisational theatre. Improvisation also being a concept that does not adhere to structure and hierarchy is not only carnivalesque in nature, but also is something that reflects the story and attitude of the troupe of fools, who go from improvising their drinks, to improvising their sailing, to improvising their very lives. In essence, for the troupe of fools, life is not only just an improvised performance, it is their Commedia dell'arte. As Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage. However, Brant himself still says it best.
For me, the process of mixing a blend feels a lot like a stage performance. They both thrive on a bit of spontaneity. Sometimes I'll throw in an unexpected twist, be it water lamp, sunflare everlasting, or Angelica. I love to explore that freedom, unbound by ingredient combos or strict measurements. Just pour out your ideas and let them blend in. Sometimes that's all it takes. You'll never know what unique taste might emerge next. That sense of unknown, filled with endless possibilities, has always intrigued me. It would be such a joy if one day you could share a special blend that's uniquely yours.
As a final small point, let's talk a little bit about pirates. Brant and his crew aren't just performers, but also effectively banished criminals, or de facto pirates. And to be honest, this section was a little bit difficult to compose, because the thing with pirates is that they're mostly morally dubious and oftentimes downright evil, which Brant and his character obviously are not, even if they are pretty much quite literally pirates by design. So eventually I started looking at a lot of pirate stories where you have this kind of trope of the virtuous pirate. And one thing I kind of realized is that a lot of these stories with virtuous pirates like Brant fell around a certain period of history, being the period of Romanticism. So what is Romanticism? Romanticism was essentially a cultural movement around the late 1700s, about half a century after the golden age of piracy. It's a movement that focuses on the beauty of the world, on individuality, and a focus of emotion over rationality and logic. And when you compare that to everything we've already covered in this video, it checks out, right? Appreciating beauty, individuality over strict unification, even focusing on laughter and emotion. It's not an exaggeration to say that Brant and his troupe of fools have a worldview that is essentially iconic of Romanticist values. And this is where we need to tie in piracy, because as we said before, the Romanticist movement started hitting the gas, really, about half a century after the historical golden age of piracy in the early 1700s. So how are these two things even relevant when they're about 50 to 60 years apart from each other? Basically, during Romanticist times, pirates, in literature especially, took on this sort of more-than-life appeal, as not just criminals, but people who existed above the rotten systems of hierarchies, of law, of society that Romanticists themselves despised. So there ended up being a whole genre of stories of these noble pirates and privateers that were quite popular during Romanticist times. And you can see this through the dichotomy, or the comparison, of Brant's story quest when Brant is compared and used as a character foil for Ulrich, with one only caring about treasure and being immoral and self-serving, while Brant always puts his crew and his value of freedom above greed. It is these Romanticist perceptions have given piracy a bit of a glorified nature, with even piracy in the 20th century still taking on these supposedly civilized codes of behaviors, with captains like Hans Langsdorff. This Romanticist trope of the good, morally virtuous pirate who happened to fight against corrupt authorities is echoed in a lot of movies and texts, like Captain Blood, a little bit even in Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and even in modern times with series like One Piece. In essence, Brant is fighting not for treasure, but for the joy and freedom of his crew. In everything he does, he makes sure that the legend of the wanted, flaming immortal lives not only on the sea, but in the hearts of those under the tight, corrupt grip of the Order of the Deep.
Course is set and we're ready for the seas.
Righto. Let's take this show to the next stage, shall we?